Hi everyone. Today we just have a short lecture on peer-reviewed sources and literature searches. So what we're going to do, sort of in three parts, is uh, talk about what we mean by the peer-reviewed literature, and then we're going to walk through the steps to access the peer-reviewed literature. So I'll pause the video and switch over to the KUKA website, show you how to access things. And then we'll conclude by discussing strategies for locating additional sources. So let's get started. What do we mean by the peer-reviewed literature? Well, what we mean are papers that have been reviewed by other experts in the field. An expert is someone who's published in that field, published at least one paper in that field. Peer review typically is an anonymous process so that reviewers aren't influenced one way or the other by a person's name, their prestige, or complete lack of prestige. And there's a typo on that slide. Sorry about that. So the peer review process goes something like this. Academics, usually a group of academics, will submit a paper to a journal. That's usually done online or through email. The journal recruits 2 or 3 peer reviewers and distributes the paper with the authors' names and institutional affiliations stripped. So they distribute an anonymous copy to those reviewers. The reviewers review the paper and provide written feedback, and usually a decision about whether or not the paper should be accepted. And then they return that to the journal. The journal assembles the feedback and makes a decision about whether or not the paper is accepted, and then the feedback in that decision is transmitted back to the author. So there's typically 3 outcomes from a peer review process. Could be an acceptance, could be a revise and resubmit, or it could be a rejection. So accept is sort of the best outcome, but it is incredibly rare. Revise and resubmit is a common outcome. I've never had, well, with one exception, I've never had papers flat out accepted. Most of the time, it's a revise and resubmit. That's sort of the best positive outcome that, in my experience. Rejections are very common, and when that happens, you're free to submit your paper to another journal. Rejection is probably a bad outcome, but or probably would be considered a bad outcome, but certainly not the end of the world, and certainly something very common in academia. When someone gets a revise and resubmit, that's exactly what it sounds like. You're given a list of revisions, and you respond to those revisions, and then you resubmit the paper for consideration. Often, although not always, oftentimes revise and resubmits will convert to acceptances. So that's sort of the pathway to acceptance. So let's talk about sources that you are welcome to use in your work for this class. Peer-reviewed articles are going to be the most common. We're going to look at some of those today when we move into the library. Probably 95% of what you use is going to be sort of peer-reviewed stuff. Journal articles, peer-reviewed literature is sort of a synonym for a journal article. The journal article, especially in social work, in fact, this is true in most of the social sciences, this is the most common sort of form of academic knowledge. Academics in social work, myself included, we publish articles in order to advance our career, and that's really in order to get tenure. So quick aside, someone has tenure based on their title. An assistant professor is a new professor. He or she does not have tenure. When an assistant professor is promoted to associate professor, then they have tenure. They've gone up for a review, and peers have determined that their contributions to science have been substantial enough to sort of warrant a lifetime appointment. From associate, you can go to full professor, and that's sort of the pinnacle of one's career. That's where most people in my line of work would endeavor to end their career. So peer-reviewed articles are going to be probably 95% of what you use in your work for this class and for lots of other graduate level classes. And that's good because peer-reviewed articles are plentiful. They're very easy to access. Like I said, I'm going to show you here in a second. You can use scholarly books, textbooks, a couple of seminal works. You can also use government reports or publications. Most of the time these are accessed on government websites or sort of government repositories, which typically are websites. You know something's a government website when it, if it's federal, it'll end in .gov, and then state websites will have sort of their own domain names and things like that. Occasionally, you could use organizational reports or long-form journalism, things from the Atlantic or the Economist. Occasionally, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal has long-form sort of investigative kinds of reports, and those are things that you're welcome to use. Although, frankly, they're things that you use rarely, only because they're just simply not as plentiful as a peer-reviewed article. I should point out that organizational reports, government reports, and long-form journalism, it's not peer-reviewed, so you should be a little bit more skeptical of these kinds of things. And in fact, evaluating sources is something we'll talk about here in a second. Things to avoid. This is only a partial list, but Wikipedia sort of tops that. Short-form journalism should generally be avoided, so that's things like press releases and newspaper articles. The sort of day-to-day, news releases that you see on CNN or MSNBC or anything like that. And then, of course, you should avoid disreputable websites. I don't really have any guidelines for identifying disreputable websites, but you sort of know them when you see them. What I do have are some guidelines to, let me just move myself real quick, some guidelines to follow when evaluating sort of the credibility of sources. And so these are typically things I ask myself when I'm evaluating the credibility of a source. Is it recent? Is it published by reputable people? Are they transparent about their methods? Are their claims reasonable and consistent with other sources? And do they draw careful conclusions from their data? If there is no data or they have very little data, I would be incredibly cautious about that. So let me just say a few more things about the points on this slide. Sometimes a seminal paper isn't really that recent. I'll give you an example. I cite a paper all the time by a guy named George Sifnios, who wrote in 1973. He coined a term called alexithymia, and that just happens to be a variable in my own research agenda. But I cite his paper from 1973, which obviously is very old. But that's simply where he introduced the term. That's part of my research agenda. Secondly, if something's published by reputable people, they usually have a web presence, even if it's a very minor one, but they have an institutional affiliation. They're listed on a website. They list their education and their training. You can see that they have advanced degrees, so on and so forth. And then a good, credible source should always be transparent about its methods. It should tell you how it collected the data, what the data look like, and that'll be present in all of the journal articles you see in the methods section. And then you'll as you become familiar with peer-reviewed literature, you'll start to see how reasonable and sort of data-driven claims are made. So just real quick before I switch over to the SWK website and we go to the library, let me just give you a few ideas about searching for peer-reviewed literature. So literature is dynamic. Things are added probably weekly, sometimes daily, depending on the time of year and the database. Occasionally things are corrected and retracted, so the literature is sort of alive. A search that you do today is not going to return the same results as a search you do, a few weeks from now. It's also important to remember that not all papers are in the public domain. Some have to be accessed through an institutional subscription. So really going to the library website is sort of the best way to access the peer-reviewed literature. What this means for us is that searches really need to be ongoing and they need to be repeated in multiple databases. I'm going to show you how to a quick shortcut for this. But a few caveats. What I'm going to show you is what I do. I recommend that you develop some search strategies that work for you. Like I said, I'm only showing you what it is that I do. This is what works for me. You're welcome to take whatever you like from my process and amend it however you like. I do recommend casting as wide a net as possible. I do not recommend using filters. They don't always seem to work. They seem to filter out things that might be useful. Instead, what I recommend doing is reading titles to determine whether or not a paper is going to be useful. Occasionally, I'm asked about Google Scholar. My general position is that Google Scholar should not replace searching in a library database. It could be done in addition to searching in a library database, but it should not be the only place that you're searching. Google Scholar only typically can access things that are in the public domain, and not everything is in the public domain. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video real quick and switch over to the SWK College website. All right, so here we are. This is just obviously the homepage of SWK College, swk.edu. Here's how I get to the library. I know there's other ways to do it, but this is just what I've found works for me. So I go into academics and then down to Leitner Library. And I realize that there's a find an article up here. I usually click on this one for whatever reason. Again, I don't, or I suppose this one you could click on as well. It probably doesn't matter. It takes you to the same place. Nice thing, of course, is that you can sort of do this from anywhere. You don't have to be on campus, and it doesn't really matter if the library is open or not. So you click on Find an Article, and what it does is it takes you to this big list of databases that SWK buys access to. They're arranged sort of alphabetically here. Starts with Bio 1 and ends with looks like Up to Date. So here's where I go. I go to EBSCOhost, which is sort of just about in the middle. And you'll probably have to sign in. I was in here earlier today, so I don't have to sign in. It seemed to have remembered me, but you'll probably have to sign in. And then Academic Search Premier is what we want. It should be checked already, but hit Continue, and then that takes you to this page right here. Search box here, some search options. Let me show you what it is I do to perform a slightly wider or slightly broader search than you would otherwise. Click on Choose Databases, and what happens is you get this these sort of tick boxes here. One of them's ticked, a bunch of them are not. But what I like to do is search in a few databases simultaneously. So I usually search in criminal justice abstracts, health source, Medline, and psych articles. That'll hit most of the social science literature that would be useful to you. You might be saying to yourself, why not hit Select All? I mean, you could. The issue is that you're going to get a lot of things that probably are not useful. So things from, the art museum image gallery, things from newspaper source, and you just sort of have to then, wade through all that stuff. So I find that clicking just these couple of things typically returns results that are useful without returning things too many things that are not useful. So hit OK. And now what we're doing is, like I said, we're searching in multiple databases at the same time. From here, what we're doing is just keyword searches. We're going to talk about keywords a couple of different times here, but important thing to think about with respect to keywords is that the search function takes those terms pretty literally. So, for example, I searched alcohol abuse here, and alcohol abuse is very different from say, oops, a term I should spell right, a term like alcoholism. And as we can see, when we search alcoholism instead of alcohol abuse, we get very different searches here, even though arguably things like alcohol abuse and alcoholism are similar, or at least synonymous kinds of terms. So you should be thinking about multiple keywords. Another sort of synonymous term is alcohol misuse, and we get something that's even different there. Okay, so what? Let me just pause the video and actually no, I guess I don't need to. Let's move this over here. So so what we get are a list of sources here, a list of returns. You can click on PDF full text, and you'll be taken right to the article. This one has a cover page, but the article really starts here on this second page. Note that most articles do give you a list of keywords. I recommend reviewing that list of keywords in order to find other terms to add to your the sort of list of things that you're searching. You may notice over here on the left-hand side there are ways to limit the results that are returned. These are called filters. I don't recommend their use, and the reason is that they filter out things that are probably going to be useful. So, for example, if we clicked on full text, it would have filtered some things out. The reason I don't like this full text thing is something we're going to talk about when I return to the PowerPoint presentation. If you find a paper that's useful and QKit does not have access to it, they will get the paper for you. There's a listserv that they can post to, and other librarians will put up a copy of the paper and they'll get it for you. So I don't like these. I don't like these filters or these limiting options because they filter out things that typically are useful. So I don't recommend their use. What I recommend instead is just going through each of the results and figuring out, based on title, the things that would be useful for you. You can use the folder function here to start to build a collection of articles, that kind of thing. So let me switch back to the PowerPoint presentation, and we will finish up. Okay, so like I said, that's what I do. I recommend developing search strategies that work for you. So real quick, you should never have to pay to access an article. QKit is able to get those things for you if you run into a paywall. It may take a few days, especially if it's a weekend or a holiday, but they should be able to get things for you. That's especially the case if you find an article that you think is gonna be helpful. Occasionally, if you're really stuck, let me know. I can try to help you locate. I can help you locate something. But again, you should never have to pay for access to an article. That access is provided as part of your tuition dollars. So what we did just now is we did a keyword search. But for example, for the paper in this class, your task really is to find 15 or 20 useful peer-reviewed sources. And searching by keyword is only one strategy for finding sources. Let me give you a couple of ideas about some other things you can do. First off, make sure you're always adding to your keyword list. Trauma is different from traumatic, which is different from post-traumatic stress disorder. So make sure you're searching for all of the synonyms that you could be. Make sure you're adding to your keywords from the list of keywords that are provided in articles. Search by author. Um, uh, People tend to publish in the same area, so searching by an author's name should bring up all of the papers that they've ever published. They might not always be first. They might have graduate students or postdocs um, who are uh, who are first, um, and that's probably because they have someone that they're mentoring. But that's a good way to identify additional sources as well. Lastly, the single most thing you can do to identify additional papers that will be helpful is read the references of papers you find that are going to be helpful. References will always be the very last section. Oftentimes they're in alphabetical order or they're numbered. It depends on the style convention that the journal follows. But this is the single most important thing or most helpful thing you can do to identify additional useful papers is read the references of papers that you find helpful. That's really what distinguishes sort of literature searching at the undergraduate level from literature searching at the graduate level. This brings us to the last point: is how do I know when I've read enough? Well, you know that you've read enough when you stop learning new information, when you start to see that the things that you're reading are not really adding anything new, but they're really reinforcing and repeating what it is you already know. That's how you know when you've read enough. So just to conclude, I find searching in the literature one of the most sort of fun parts of being a social work scholar. This is sort of where the state of the art or the cutting edge information is contained, and it's sort of like a little treasure hunt, if you will. So if you get stuck, you remember you're always welcome to um, consult with me if you're having trouble or if you have questions. I'm happy to help. Okay, thanks for watching.